Father God, we thank you so much for this time that we get to spend together this evening to dive into your word. And we just pray, God, for your guidance, for your spirit as we walk through the book of Leviticus. God, would you continue to teach us as you have, and would you just encourage us with what you have for us in the Bible tonight. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
All right. So you had 2 weeks off, I guess 1 week off, but 2 weeks to kind of catch up on reading and videos and all that stuff. So are you all caught up?
We love those videos. Those are really, he's quite the speaker.
Tim Mackey.
Oh, the sermon one from this week? Oh, on atonement?
Went ahead and listened to
We listened to the future one.
The whole series?
Not all of it yet, but we will.
He's really one of my favorite teachers. That's why I use him for the class and all his resources and stuff. He's an amazing teacher. And I feel like that sermon does a really good job of talking about atonement, which is our main topic for tonight. He talks about atonement like for the modern day, like what does it mean to us right now, versus what we're going to talk about tonight, which is not really modern, but ancient. So we have 5 chapters of law code, and then we're going to get into the Day of Atonement. And I want to kind of rush through those 5 chapters. That's sort of my plan. And spend most of our time on Leviticus 16 and talk a lot about the Day of Atonement and Azazel and all those fun topics. So does that sound good? Okay, so I want to open up our textbook here. Instead of, I am going to teach some things out of these 5 chapters. But I want to go back to something that probably you haven't read in the last week and a half and just remind us of, because it's going to be the thing that gives us the background for these 5 chapters. So this is from page 157. If you want to read along, you're welcome to. You don't have to. He says, with this cultic map in place. So what cultic map? What's the map he's talking about? If you were to draw a map of what we've been studying. The tabernacle, right? I could draw it for you, but
rectangle.
You see it in your mind already. And that map is that at the altar you have the place where the sacrifices are made, at the basin, the place where the washing and the purification is done. You have the lampstand shining its light on the table of showbread. You have the altar of incense, which in Revelation represents the prayers of the saints. And then you have the most holy place, inside of which is the Ark of the Covenant, with the mercy seat, the cherubim, and the presence of the Lord sitting between the cherubim. So that's the map, right? That's that cultic map. With this cultic map in place, we can begin to understand the rationale for why some animals, objects, or people are classified as either clean or unclean. One leading idea argued by Douglas is that the notion of wholeness and normality served as the primary distinction between clean and unclean. Wenham, however, rightly subsumed these helpful categories under the more fundamental opposition between life and death, noting that while childbirth, menstruation, and sexual intercourse would surely have been considered normal, yet they still caused uncleanness because each involved the loss of life liquids, barring people from worship until they recovered from such loss. He goes on to talk about animals. Many of the unclean animals are associated with death in some fashion, whether being carnivorous predators, scavengers living in caves, or like pigs being associated with underworld deities and pagan worship. Along these lines, creatures that demonstrate some abnormality within their class, like fish without scales, are considered further from the wholeness of an ordered cosmos in terms of life. So, with that kind of in mind, what is the thing that we ought to have kind of in the back of our mind as we're looking at Leviticus chapters 11 through 15? It's life and death, right? Remember, by the way, and this was 2 weeks ago, so I don't blame you if you forgot, but remember where we are in the story, right? This is a story. What just happened? Nadab and Abihu just walked into the tabernacle with the fire that was the fire that didn't come from Yahweh, and they were killed. Consumed. And so the place of life, the house of God, on the priest's first day of the job, walked in there and brought death in. So God's house has death in it. That's the problem that we're going to stop the story. We're going to stop the narrative and go, how do we deal with the fact that God's house has death in it? All right? That's what Leviticus 11 is doing. And you can kind of see that. And the first thing I wanted to point out tonight, if you go back to chapter 10, they take the censers and the fire and they bring it inside. And then they're killed. And Moses calls these other two guys to carry their brothers out, their cousins. And God's speaking to Moses and Aaron and Eleazar and Ithamar, and he gives some more commands. This is what you would call narrative literature. It is a story that's taking place in a sequence of events. It's really simple, but it actually, people miss this because it's Leviticus, and we think Leviticus is more complicated than it is. But what we just read in chapter 10 was narrative. What we're about to read in chapter 11, we're stepping back out of the narrative, and we're getting into a type of literature that is referred to as law code. So we're going from, we're telling a story, to now we are stopping the story. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of laws, and then we'll pick the story up again later. Okay? So we're back to law code. What's unique about this law code? Right here in chapter 11, Yahweh speaks to Moses and Aaron. So this is unique. I don't know if you would have noticed this if you were looking for it, but if you go back to the law code from before, back in Leviticus 1 through 7, Yahweh speaks to Moses, right? And then if you go back even further, Yahweh spoke to Moses. And so here in chapter 10, after the narrative of chapters 8 through 10, here in chapter 11, Yahweh speaks to Moses and Aaron. So why is Aaron involved in this new set of law code when he wasn't involved in the last set?
This is now after Aaron's ordination.
It's after his ordination, exactly. And so he's taken on the role of the high priest, which until his ordination was really kind of, we saw Moses in that position. Even though he maybe didn't have the title, he sort of was in that position. Now you still have Moses, but you also have Aaron as the high priest. So he's been added to Yahweh's sort of people who he speaks directly to. And he goes to them and he starts giving these commands about clean and unclean animals. Speak to the people of Israel, saying, these are the living things that you may eat among all the animals on the earth. So this is really interesting. I think that we skip over this in English, but in Hebrew, this is a really fascinating sentence that I just read. Because what it doesn't say is, these are all the animals you can eat, and these are the animals you can't eat. What he says is, these are all the living that you can eat among all the animals. And remember, what's supposed to be in the back of our mind, that Morales just said as we read through these chapters, life and death. Right? And so what's the distinction? What makes a fish good to eat and a dolphin not good to eat? On the surface, it's scales. Right? And who cares about scales? What makes a cow good to eat and a camel not good to eat? It's chewing the cud. Who cares if it chews the cud? It's still got meat in its muscles, right? But it comes down to this idea right here of the living things. These are the living things that you can eat among all the animals. So this word for living is, I'm going to struggle with this. So if you don't know, I kind of had a flu this weekend, and I feel totally better, but my voice is kind of rough. So I might struggle with the Hebrew. I might struggle with the Hebrew. But the word here is chaya. It's similar to haya, which is where we derive the name of God, Yahweh. But that little letter, even though it doesn't sound very different to us, is actually, makes it an entirely different word in Hebrew. So chaya, if you have it as a verb, it means to live. Chai is a living thing. Chaya, which is, there's no difference really to our ear, but that was a totally different word that I just said, means a living. So chaya is a living thing, and chaya is life, and chaya is a living thing. That doesn't matter. You've heard, you've watched movies, right? Like Fiddler on the Roof, l'chaim. It comes from this word. They add the la in front. It means two, and then chaim is life. They toast l'chaim to life. It's so anyway. So they eat the living things. It's not that the other animals aren't living things, but this idea of life is the thing that is pervasive in these chapters, and separates out what is the life animals versus the death animals, not so much the living versus the dead. Does that make any sense?
Okay.
Yeah, now I've got that song stuck in my head.
All right.
So, John, in the New King James, it doesn't say that. Verse 2 says, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, these are the animals which you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth."
Exactly, and I think that is something that's totally lost because, as I said, the word in the ESV translated living things, which translates there as the first use of animals, is chaya, and the second word for animals is behema, which is the word for beasts, and is actually the root word for behemoth, if you recognize it from Job, behema, behemoth. So, yeah, they really have kind of lost the meaning there. I don't want to badmouth translators
Yeah.
because they're great, right? And they've given us the Bible in English, which is what we really need. But they really sort of lost it on that one. Yeah.
So, now I'm confused. I mean, we learned some of this stuff a long time ago, but it chews the cud, but so does a cat.
Right.
But so the difference is the cloven hoof, which for whatever reason.
Well, they can't eat a rock badger because it has a paw and not a hoof, right? But if you're hungry, do you care if the animal has a paw or a hoof? Well, of course not.
It's got the hair also.
Yes.
Which people eat rabbit.
Rabbit is good.
Yeah, absolutely. I've eaten rabbit. Yeah.
But you're not Jewish.
Huh?
But you're not Jewish.
But I'm not Jewish, so it's fine. So I wanted to point that out because I think that line right there, especially when you look at those Hebrew words, it really emphasizes that we're dealing with the difference between life and death, and that these laws sometimes feel arbitrary. And I think the reason they sometimes feel arbitrary is because the law itself isn't necessarily always the important thing, but it's symbolizing something greater than itself, which means that sometimes it feels arbitrary because it is arbitrary. Is that okay to say?
Well, it's arbitrary from our perspective.
Well, totally. Well, so we're going to get to, here in a few minutes, to the Day of Atonement. Does the goat that the high priest puts the sin on, lays his hands on to transfer the sin, is he literally carrying sin into the wilderness? No, it's just it's the means by which God set up to say, if you do this, and it represents something greater than what it is, then I'm not going to hold that sin to your account. I'm going to hold it to this goat's account, and it's going to carry it away from you. The goat doesn't have an account for sin. It's a goat, right? And so it's arbitrary because it is arbitrary, but also it's not arbitrary because it's the way that God set up for him to dwell in the presence of Israel. So I just want to kind of comfort you with that, as sometimes these things feel weird, and it's because they are. Cool? All right. So skipping on past the rest of these animals. Purification after childbirth. So this is a fun one for me. Pastor Matt asked me to teach a sermon, a Christmas sermon, like 4 years ago. And this is the chapter I chose to teach on because in Leviticus chapter 12, you get these commandments about the time of impurity or uncleanness of a woman after she gives birth. And after that time, what they do is they take the child to the tent of meeting, and if it's a son, they circumcise him on the 8th day at the tabernacle, later the temple, and they offer a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. And all of that you actually see take place in Luke chapter 2, when Jesus is born. And so I just wanted to be kind of a weirdo, and I decided to teach a Christmas sermon out of Leviticus chapter 12 because, so in the Torah we have a lot of negative laws. And what I mean by negative laws is the do-nots. Don't do this, don't do this, don't sleep with your mother-in-law, right?
Oh, God, no.
So, like, Jesus fulfilled the law, the whole law, but sometimes it's hard to see how he fulfills a law because it's a negative law. Jesus never slept with his mother-in-law, and I'm like, well, great, I haven't slept with my mother-in-law either, so, like, awesome. But sometimes you have a positive law, which is when you have a child taken to the tabernacle, circumcise him on the 8th day, make the sacrifice, the turtle dove or the pigeon, and when you have those positive laws, you get the glimpses in the gospel accounts of how Jesus specifically fulfills those laws. So I think that this is really a powerful chapter to kind of learn and understand because of the way that we get to see Jesus specifically fulfilling Leviticus chapter 12. Yeah, great. Okay, so why, before we move on, why is a woman unclean after childbirth?
Because she lost a lot of blood.
There you go. And blood represents?
Life.
Life. So we're not dealing with, well, the man is not unclean and the woman is, because the Bible has a low view of women and a high view of men. Like, we are in a patriarchal society as we're reading this, but that's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the loss of the life fluids, the bodily fluids that represent life, and that's what makes a person unclean. So why is she unclean for twice as long if she bears a female than if she bears a male?
That's the question I have. Right there.
Is she?
Mm-hmm.
She
Yes.
has to continue in the blood of her purifying twice as long.
Right.
Yeah.
But it says she's only unclean for 2 weeks if she bears a female child. And it doesn't say how long she's unclean after a male.
Okay, yeah, great point. So why does she continue in the blood of her purifying for twice as
Well,
long?
and what is that? The blood.
It is, okay. So it's not clear here in the text, but there's basically this tradition that we think that this is what this is related to, of sitting essentially in a bath. And they would basically, like, in the morning, they would go in, and they would be in there all day, and then in the evening, they would go out, and they would repeat that process, and that was the process of purifying after childbirth. So I think that when it says she'll continue in the blood of her purifying for 66 days, I think it's talking about she's going to be going through that process for 66 days. With a male child, she only goes through it for 33 days.
Yeah, why?
So, okay, ladies in the room who have had children, is it a different process for a boy than it is for a girl? It's really not. A kid's a kid.
Biologically, no.
And so I think what's going on here is, what does this represent? What is the greater, the reality that's greater than the action itself? And I think what's happening is you have a woman who is in the process of losing those life fluids. The man doesn't go through that same process. And so when you have a woman who bears a female child, it's like it's almost looking into the future and seeing this next time of purification that's going to be required. And it's as though there's a greater, this is the thing, because there's not a greater need for purification for women than there is for men. Everyone needs Jesus. But there's that idea of the loss of life fluids that happens with women in a way that it doesn't happen with men. And the same thing is kind of pointed out up here in verse 2. This is taking place as at the time of her menstruation she'll be unclean. That's not a thing that men go through either. And so it's hard to kind of like get to the bottom of the idea of life and death without kind of taking on some ancient hierarchical viewpoint. Does that make sense? So there's these ideas of life and death and the bodily fluids that take place, but we also acknowledge that we're getting these laws in the construct of a patriarchal society, which ancient Israel very much was. And so it's kind of a funny thing to want to get at the truth of, like, what is this telling me about life and death and cleanness and uncleanness? And then like, without being like, and Israel thought men were better than women.
Well, it kind of comes across as she gave birth to someone who will give birth.
Right.
And therefore, she's doing double the duty because the person she gave birth to will eventually be a giver of life.
And that's exactly how I'm taking it, but you said it better.
Yeah.
Awesome. So when the days are completed, they go to the tabernacle and they make the sacrifices.
Oh, and you were right. It said unclean 7 days for a male, unclean 2 weeks for
14.
a female.
Okay. Okay.
So you did have that right.
Okay. Cool. I'm glad for that, but I didn't need to be right. But I'm glad I was anyways. It's always good to be right. Okay. Everyone happy?
Yes.
I'm kind of relying on the fact that you've read all these chapters in the last 2 weeks, so I don't need to go into details here. Chapter 13, the laws about leprosy. Leprosy represents, okay, so have you heard the teaching 1,000 times, like I have, that leprosy represents sin?
I've heard that, but I think that when they talk about in here open sores, any fluids which would be bleeding or pus or anything like that represents uncleanness, and uncleanness is not really
not sin, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But some do relate it to impurity
Yeah.
as well.
So uncleanness and impurity, I basically want to make those synonyms. And cleanness and purity, I want to make those synonyms.
Okay.
Sin sort of sits outside of the realm of impurity and uncleanness. But there is some overlap because there are some sins that will make you impure and unclean. But just the state of being impure and unclean is not sinful.
Right.
Okay.
That goes for profane and holy as well.
What do you mean?
Well, in the sense that being clean allows you to be associated with the holy, and being unclean makes you profane in the sense of being worldly and separated.
Oh, sure.
Going back to what we discussed last 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, when you absolutely think about the holiness of the priest means that they can go into the tabernacle. Even if you are an Israelite who's not unclean, you can't still just walk into the tabernacle as if you're a priest. So yeah, it goes for the profane and holy as well. There's a third category that he introduced in here from profane, that spectrum.
Profane to clean to holy.
To clean to holy, right, yeah. And he put those three on that spectrum. That's how he phrased that. So maybe, it seems like maybe y'all haven't kind of heard that teaching as frequently as I have, that leprosy represents sin. That's awesome, because it means that my job's a lot easier, because you're...
You've heard leaven a lot.
Leaven a lot, sure.
Yeah.
So a couple things here in this chapter. Okay. Once, this is 13. This is the long one of the whole bunch. Okay. All right. So, and this is, I'm just picking up this one because it's the first one I saw. This is kind of a repeated pattern throughout this chapter. Once a person is cleansed of leprosy, how long do they sit outside their tent? Did you catch this one? 7 days. They can't go into their tent until the 8th day, right? Once an article of clothing, this is talking about garments, once it's been washed, and he shuts it up for 7 days, and then they take it back out and the priest re-inspects it, and if it's clean, but if it's there for 7 days, it's coming out on the 8th day. And so this whole thing with leprosy and cleansing from leprosy is happening in a pattern of 7 days and then the 8th day. And it's the 7 days after a person is healed of leprosy, because when they have leprosy, they live outside the camp. Once they don't have leprosy, they can live inside the camp, but they have to live on a stool outside their tent. They're not allowed to live in their tent. And then on the 8th day, that's when they can re-enter their tent. And so this whole pattern of 7 and 8, which is the same pattern if you take the sort of Jewish commentator's perspective on creation in Eden, it's the same pattern of the 7 days of creation and then Adam and Eve sinning on the 8th day, which was the first day of their service of the priesthood, which then follows the pattern of Nadab and Abihu, who were consecrated or anointed for 7 days, and then on the 8th day, which was the first day of the service of their priesthood, is when they went into the tabernacle and died. This leprosy is almost like the reverse of that. So instead of being cut off on the 8th day, like Nadab and Abihu and Adam and Eve, now you are welcomed back in on the 8th day from your uncleanness. Okay, that's an important pattern when it comes to the Passion Week of Jesus. Is that 3, 7, and 8 that we see in the creation, and we see it here in the leprosy passage. We're going to see it again in Numbers 19. But there are really 2 chapters on leprosy here in Leviticus. 13 deals with people who have leprosy, and then 14 says, what do you do when a person has been healed of the leprosy that they had? So, what makes chapter 14 of Leviticus really unique? What were chapters 1 through 7 about? You remember? The sacrifices.
Yeah.
We talked about those 5 sacrifices. We went through them all 2 times in chapters 1 through 7. And the order changed and we saw chiastic structures. It was this whole fun thing to take a look at. But that was all of the sacrifices for Israel to do, right? But then we get to Leviticus chapter 14, and what we find is that here is instructions for another sacrifice. And this is the first, really, of 3 occurrences in the Torah of sacrifices that Israel would do outside of Leviticus 1 through 7. So there are 3 other chapters. There's Leviticus 14, and there's Leviticus 16, and then there's Numbers 19. And those 3 chapters talk about sacrifices that Israel had to do, but they stand outside of that Leviticus 1 through 7 section, and all 3 of the sacrifices are related to each other in really interesting ways. So let's just get into it, and it's kind of weird, but I think it's fun and interesting, and I don't really know what to do with it. So, Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, this shall be the law for the leprous person on the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall go out of the camp, of course, because the leprous person is out of the camp. And the priest shall look. Then, if the case of leprous disease is healed in the leprous person, the priest shall command them to take for him who is to be cleansed 2 live clean birds. Okay? That's not like any of the other sacrifices so far. And cedar wood, and scarlet yarn, and hyssop. And although we haven't gotten to Numbers 19 yet, y'all have heard me talk about it probably enough times to go, those are the same things as Numbers 19. And the priest shall command them to kill one of the birds in an earthenware vessel over fresh water. Okay. By the way, this word for fresh is chaya. It's living, the living things from before, chapter 11. So living water. Okay, so what does living water mean for you? What does that invoke in you from just what you know about the Bible?
The Spirit of God.
It's the Spirit. Yeah, totally. John chapter 8. Rivers of living water will flow out of your heart. And he said this about the Spirit, but they didn't know it yet because he hadn't yet ascended. It's the Spirit. Yeah, totally. It is the, okay. So in the process of salvation, well, let me just ask it this way, and if it's wrong, it's wrong. In the process of salvation, at what point does the Spirit come? Let me phrase it this way instead. In the process of Jesus' death and burial and resurrection and ascension, at what point does the Spirit come? After. Because you have his ascension in Acts chapter 1, and then the coming of the Spirit in Acts chapter 2. But if the cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet yarn, the cedar wood like the cross, and the hyssop was the branch they used to lift up the sour wine on the sponge, and the scarlet yarn representing that robe that they pulled off of him after they taunted him, if all that is representing that death of Jesus, and then you're combining all of the things representing the death of Jesus with the thing that represents the Holy Spirit. What these sacrifices do, the ones that contain the cedarwood, the scarlet yarn, the hyssop, and the living water, is they're taking all of those things that are not going to come about until the New Testament, right? This is the shadow of things to come, as Hebrews says, is combining all of those into one picture for us of salvation, of not so much salvation, but purification. And what does the purification from uncleanness of an Israelite mean for us in terms of our purification from the uncleanness of our contact with death and our contact with the world, accomplished through Jesus and the descension of the Spirit? Did I do a terrible job explaining that? Okay.
No.
All right.
I think I understand.
Great. Okay, so the priest, so you have an earthenware vessel. That earthenware vessel is filled with living water, and then you kill one of the birds in it. So what happens to the fresh water, the living water?
It's blood.
It gets mixed with blood.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is the water in the earthenware, or is it says over fresh water, doesn't it?
Yes. So I think the idea here, whether you have the earthenware vessel over fresh water, meaning like they do this at a river, or meaning they have put fresh water in the earthenware vessel. I've always pictured the fresh water being in the earthenware vessel. I guess that's a good question, and I never thought to ask it. I think either way, the idea is that you're mixing blood and water, right? Because what does a mixture of blood and water have to do with Jesus' death? Remember when they take the spear and they put it in there and the blood and water comes out, right? Okay, and so I think that is just all part of this one big picture. He takes the live bird and the scarlet yarn and the hyssop and the cedar wood, and he dips them in the blood of the bird that was killed over the fresh water. So I don't know which bird it's worse to be. I don't want to be either. But one is killed and his blood's in the earthenware vessel. The other one, he takes it and dips it in the blood of the other bird. And then what does he do with the second bird?
Let's it go.
Let's go.
He just lets it go into the wilderness. And so that bird is taking the blood of the first bird away into the wilderness. But what else is done with the blood?
Or was he freed by the blood?
Free bird.
I think in how this is going to connect to the Day of Atonement, I think it's important that he's carrying something away into the wilderness. Now, we make it through Day of Atonement, and you might say, I think you were wrong about that other thing. That's totally fine. That's just how I'm taking it. But the blood is sprinkled 7 times, and he's pronounced clean, and then he lets the living bird go. So it's like the life-giving blood, right? Because the life is in the blood, is sprinkled on the uncleanness 7 times. So it takes the 7, to make a new creation or to make a creation, it takes the pattern of 7, just like Genesis 1, sprinkled 7 times. This guy is clean instead of unclean, and the bird then carries the life or carries the blood into the wilderness, into the open field. So, a lot of similarities between this and the Day of Atonement, and we're going to get more into that.
My question about the scapegoat.
Okay.
The scapegoat carries the sin into the wilderness with it,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So the sin is not, it's removed from the one place,
Yes.
but it's not destroyed.
We're going to get to that because I actually think that we'll get to that. We're almost to chapter 16. I know, Linda, you're just like, stop talking about 14. I want to talk about 16. All right, we'll get there.
While we're still in 14, I
Go
have
ahead.
a question about what is a log of oil?
A log of oil. What verse is that in?
Right
This
there.
Oh, right
is
there.
it 12?
One log. A log was about 1/3 of a quart, or 0.3 liters.
Okay, so that's a measurement. Okay,
I think so,
missed
yeah.
that. All right,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah, no, good question. That's one of those things where I tell people to read carefully and then I don't. And so I'm like, what do you mean log of oil? All right. That was all I needed to talk about in this chapter. So is there more questions on 14 before we move on to 15? Go ahead.
They said something in here that I noticed in my translation. I think it's chapters, it's 14, verse 17, where they dip the blood and they put it on the thumb of the right hand and on the big toe and everything. And that's the same thing as what they do for priests.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it is the same thing. They put it on for the priest, it was the right earlobe. Is that the same here? Yeah, the lobe of the right ear, the thumb of the right hand, and the big toe of the right foot. Yep, same for the priest.
But then they put oil on top of the blood here.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And why is it the right?
Why is it the right? So I actually had that on my notes for 2 weeks ago, and then we ran out of time. So I don't have those notes with me. But I had like a selection of about 8 verses throughout Isaiah, going into Hebrews, which talks about Jesus sitting down at the right hand of the Father. That basically, like, the right side seemed to have some kind of association with authority or power, something to do with the rule. And so of the research that I did with it and the verses that I had, which I can probably look up again for you if you ask me this week, it seemed to talk about the, there's two roles that you have to be anointed for, Messiah for. The king had to be anointed and the priest had to be anointed. And so that the right side representing power or authority seemed to be associated with that kingly anointing, even though it's being done to the priests. And so kind of what I concluded from it was this almost dual role of Jesus being the king priest, the one who fulfills the Davidic covenant of the eternal kingship of David and the Levitic covenant of the eternal priesthood of Levi, being the fulfillment of both of those things. And so that right side, as far as I understood, was sort of associated with that rule of the king.
I believe also that reading the Torah had to be with the right hand. You use the right hand, not the left.
Well, now they use what's called a yadah.
The
It's called yadah because it looks like this, if you've ever seen one. It's this little metal stick about this long. Kristen got me one for my birthday one year. It's a little metal stick about that long, and it has a hand on one end of it, and the hand is doing this, and it's called a yadah because yadah is the Hebrew word for right hand. And the reason that priests started using that is because as scrolls deteriorated, the oils from their fingers would deteriorate them further, and so they started using that to like read along on the page. So yeah, I can bring that sometime and show you what it looks like if you want. It's pretty neat. Yeah, so there you go.
I always kind of figured when they refer to the right hand, that's most people are right hand dominated.
Mm-hmm.
So it's your strong side. Your
Sure.
left side is weaker, and in general. I don't know what the percentages are.
And that,
It's very high.
by the way, there's an interesting biblical story in Judges that's going to come up about right-handedness and left-handedness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fat man.
Ehud. Yeah, we had in one of my classes in Uganda, one of my students was a rather large fellow, and after we read that story in Judges, all the other students started calling him Ehud. It was his nickname. But it was not offensive because in Uganda it's good to be fat, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. Anyways, so laws about bodily discharges. Okay, it used to be that like when I was a teenager, and people would ask you like, "What's your life verse? Like, what's the verse that it's almost like a mantra for you?" And I always hated that. I was always like, "You don't know anything about me, grown-ups." Right? And so I would always say Leviticus 15:2 because I just thought I was being so funny. And I would get looks like that, Linda, that you're giving me right now. Because it was such a dumb teenager answer thing to say. It says, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when a man has a bodily discharge, this discharge is unclean." That's the verse. Okay, so the bottom line is I'm a dummy. But knowing what we know now, how important actually is that verse to the laws of Israel about cleanness and uncleanness? Because what does the loss of bodily fluids represent? It's
Loss of
death.
life.
You can't go into the presence of God with death. you have to go through the process of purification, or else you're doing what Nadab and Abihu did, and you're bringing death into the tabernacle.
Right.
God forbid we defile his house, right? Because that is that story is undergirding these chapters. We have to keep that in mind, that like this is being written and this is being recorded in such a way as to break up that day. So in the morning in chapter 10, Nadab and Abihu died. In the evening in chapter 16, we're going to start talking about the Day of Atonement. And so it's like this law code is splitting up the narrative intentionally, because that Nadab and Abihu incident needs to be at the forefront of our mind if we're ever going to understand these laws. And so what do the laws about bodily discharges have to do with Nadab and Abihu? You get it when it's all about life and death, right? Cool?
Yeah, so that, just to be sure,
Yes.
clear, that they are talking about any kind of open wounds and
this chapter will go on to talk about a lot of different kinds of things. This is not authoritative, but I feel like that verse is talking about like syphilis.
okay,
I feel like
weeping sores.
weeping sores. I mean,
All right.
yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So, before we're done with chapter 15, one little verse at the bottom here stands out as being very important. In verse 31 it says, thus, so we just had a whole chapter about bodily fluids coming out. Okay, they make you unclean, you can't worship God if you have bodily fluids coming out. So, verse 31, thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness. How would they die in their uncleanness? By defiling my tabernacle that's in their midst. So is being unclean a cause for death? It's not.
No.
But you would die in your uncleanness if you brought that uncleanness into the presence of God in worship. And so that's why we have all these purification laws and purity, what's pure, what's impure, what's clean, what's unclean, because if they didn't know that, then they risked repeating the Nadab and Abihu incident, right? Which we talked about 2 weeks ago, and maybe you forgot. It's right after that incident, they get the law about no one can drink in the service of the tabernacle. And so we talked about the clear-headedness that they had to have to discern, right? We had a discussion on that word, what it meant to discern what was pure and what was impure for the people. And alcohol would keep them from doing that. I can barely keep track of all these laws sober.
Really?
So, there you go. Okay, so, now look at verse 1 of chapter 16. Yahweh spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron. So we just went through 5 chapters of law code, and now we are diving right back into the narrative that we left off in chapter 10. And this narrative picks up at the end of chapter 10. Nadab and Abihu are dead. Their bodies have been removed from the tabernacle, but now there is this uncleanness in the tent. And that uncleanness in the tent, or defilement in the tent, meant that worship could not take place in the normal way that it was supposed to take place. Because the house of God had been desolated?
Defiled us.
I think I want to say desolated by an abomination. Because what happened is that man introduced something into the space of worship that should not have been introduced in the space of worship, that meant that worship could not take place there. So something that was unclean, or you could say an abomination, had been taken in and desolated it. Okay, so have you heard the term, the abomination of desolation? Revelation chapter 13, Daniel talks a lot about it. In Daniel chapter 11, when he's dealing with the kings of the north and the south, he gets to this guy. I don't want to make this confusing, I want to make this simple, but Daniel prophesies about a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a king, one of the kings of the 4 regions of Greece after the death of Alexander the Great. His name was Antiochus Epiphanes, and he was in a war with another Greek king who lived in Egypt. And if you have a king in the Syria area and a king in the Egypt area fighting with each other, Israel is in the middle of that fight. They're stuck in the crossfires. And so these kings were constantly taking their armies across Israel. And one day, one of the kings said, "Why are we letting the Israelites worship this God Yahweh?" It's almost like Pharaoh. "Who is Yahweh? I've never heard of this God." So he's going through and he's like, "Why are we letting the Israelites worship this king? I'm going to put a statue of the God I worship in the tabernacle." And what he did was he put up a statue of Zeus and then sacrificed a whole bunch of pigs. And what that did was it made the temple a place where they could not perform worship services. It was the abomination of desolation. And we don't really think about what those words mean, but it was the unclean thing that made it so that worship couldn't take place in the temple. We have an eschatological prophecy in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, where Paul talks about this man of lawlessness. He's going to put up a statue of himself. He's going to elevate himself above every so-called God, Paul says. And then John in Revelation 13 describes the Antichrist putting up that statue of himself in the temple. And so we have that eschatological view of the abomination of desolation. We have the intertestamental already fulfilled prophecy that when it was prophesied wasn't fulfilled yet, but we have, we live now. That prophecy of the abomination of desolation from Antiochus Epiphanes, and those things are just following a pattern. So what is the thing that went into, the first time that this pattern happened, it went into an abomination, an unclean thing, went into the tabernacle and desolated it so that worship couldn't take place? It was Nadab and Abihu. And the Day of Atonement is the resolution for that happening. So this is how God is going to fix his house being desolated by an abomination. Good? All right, moving on.
I got a stupid question.
That's probably not as stupid as you think it is.
It often refers to in the wool or linen, the warp or woof. What is warp or woof?
It's like the weave pattern. I could Google it, but it has to do with the weave. I don't know the exact terminology of what it's referring to. Do you?
I think one is the horizontal and one is the vertical.
Oh, so it's the two parts that are woven together.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, I think you're right. I feel like you're right.
So if you turn it sideways, does the warp and woof change?
I don't know.
It drapes differently, though.
Now that's a stupid question.
Pink cut on the bias, and that means it will drape differently. So, yes.
I guess, yeah.
Where's Darcy?
Yeah, right, she could answer that for you. All right, so Yahweh spoke to Moses after the death of the 2 sons of Aaron when they drew near before Yahweh and died. And Yahweh said to Moses, "Tell Aaron your brother not to come at any time into the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat that is on the ark, so that he may not die." Now there's some intonation in that, not to come at any time, or not to come at any time.
Yeah.
Like, you can't just come in willy-nilly, right? There will be, and we're about to read, of the time, the one time every year that he can go in. "For I will appear in the cloud over the mercy seat. But in this way Aaron shall come into the holy place with a bull from the herd for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He shall put on the holy linen coat and have the linen undergarment on his body, and he shall tie the linen sash around his waist and wear the linen turban. These are the holy garments." So, you know those priestly garments, the blue ones with the gems on his chest and the crown that says "Holy to Yahweh," Kadosh, Adonai. He doesn't wear those on this day. He doesn't have the Urim and the Thummim. So think about the difference between those priestly garments and what they represent, and the shininess of the gold everywhere, and the golden bells and the pomegranates and the shininess of the breastplate. What does he look like? Versus wearing the linen garment with a linen sash and the linen turban. What does he look like? In one sense, In one outfit, he's representing God to the people. And in this other outfit, it seems that he's representing the people to God. He's putting on those humble clothes and not the now I need to look like God clothes. He shall bathe his body in water and put them on, and he shall take from the congregation of the people of Israel 2 male goats for a sin offering. Okay, so that's weird, because sin offerings, what we read about before, always involved one animal, at least at a time. Like a sin offering was an animal. And now we have a sin offering that's 2 animals. It's almost like we just read about a sacrifice that was one sacrifice but involved 2 animals. It was the leprosy one with the 2 birds. Okay? And a ram for a burnt offering, by the way. Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering for himself and shall make atonement for himself and his house. Then he shall take the 2 goats and set them before Yahweh at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Here's where we get interesting. So you're at the entrance of the tent of meeting. You're picturing the tabernacle in your mind. He's standing there. He's got 2 goats. They're one offering, but they're 2 goats. And he sets them before the entrance of the tent of meeting. And he casts lots over them. 1 lot for Yahweh, and the other lot, now your NKJV says, the other lot for the scapegoat. Okay. But in the ESV, they didn't know what to do with this word, Azazel. So they decided to leave it untranslated, and instead they transliterated it. We will come back to this. Verse 9. And Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for Yahweh and use it as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before Yahweh to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away into the wilderness to Azazel. Okay. So, oh, that's tiny. Click in the right place. So, if I read this in the NIV, verse 10, but the goat chosen by Lot as the scapegoat shall be presented alive before Yahweh to be used for making atonement by sending it into the wilderness as a scapegoat. Okay? If I read it in, let me read it in the NASB. But the goat on which the lot for the scapegoat fell shall be presented alive before Yahweh to make atonement upon it, to send it into the wilderness as the scapegoat. So all of these versions have decided to translate Azazel into scapegoat. Now, you're not going to know what to do with this, but I'm just going to pull up the Hebrew for a second. Verse 10. Verse 10, La Azazel. So this word right here, I need to make this bigger, huh? It's probably pretty small up there. Okay.
We can read that now.
Yeah, now you can read it.
Yeah. Oh, I could read it.
I can read it.
Okay. Don't appreciate the attitude. So this word right here, La Azazel, is actually 2 Hebrew words. When you attach the la on the front, you're attaching the preposition to, towards, until, for, away, from, into, of, about. It is most commonly translated to. So Jesus went, well, no, that's New Testament. If Jesus went to Nazareth in the Old Testament, it would say La Nazareth, okay? But La Azazel, you would translate this most literally to Azazel. And that's what the ESV was trying to maintain by not translating Azazel as scapegoat. This word right here, Azazel, is, I brought this to Matt 7 years ago. And I was like, I just bought an ESV Bible. And my last Bible didn't say this, and now this one does, and I don't know what this word means. And he was like, why are you asking me?
Really?
And this is really the topic that made me go, I guess I need to study Leviticus. So if I'd never bought an ESV Bible, then we wouldn't be here today. So I guess, let's see. how do I want to do this? Azazel itself is a compound Hebrew word, even excluding the la. Azaz is the Hebrew word for strength, or for strong. And you recognize the Hebrew word El, right? We've talked all about how the Bible is not monotheistic, how it has the worship of one God, Yahweh, the God of Israel. Don't worship any other gods. Don't put any gods before me, which would be complete nonsense if there were no other gods, right? So right here, if I just take that word as it is in Hebrew, I would say that it may be sent away into the wilderness to the strong God. Okay. Is there any parallel passages in Scripture that we can talk about a God who and by God I mean spiritual being, who in some sense seems to be opposed to Yahweh and who lives in the wilderness? The guy with the Christmas tree? Nimrod. Nimrod has a Christmas tree? I have no idea what you're talking about, but that's awesome. I'm thinking of Matthew chapter 4, when Jesus goes into the wilderness, led by the Spirit, and then is tempted for 40 days by the devil, right? So what would be the purpose of putting the sin on the head of the goat and then sending it away into the wilderness to another God?
I kind of have a theory.
Go ahead.
Partly from reading this book. But the goats were supposed to be identical. The birds are the same bird. So I'm thinking that it's the dual nature of Jesus, that he's man and he's God. And when he dies, he ascends to God. And so the Azazel is the ascension to God.
I don't hate that, but I don't agree with it. Okay. I think I love how you're thinking, but I'm going to take this a different way.
So, if I may, it seems as though what you're getting at is Satan is responsible for the sin, and it was intended to separate the people from God. By putting the sin on the goat, God sent it back to him, but without the people. Because God figured out a way to keep the people in spite of their sin and just send the sin back on a goat.
Right. So the goat is covering for the people, right? Like if you go to a restaurant, you forget your wallet, but your friend's there, and he's like, I'll cover for you. The goat is covering for the people.
Which is the atonement.
Atonement means covering. That's totally what's happening is anytime you have that substitute, you're dealing with that idea of atonement. I finished a paper yesterday for a Greek class on Philemon, where in Philemon, Paul is writing to Philemon about a slave, Onesimus, and he says, if he's wronged you in any way, charge that to my account. Without using the word atone, Paul is saying, I'm going to be the substitute to my own loss for this guy.
That brings up an interesting point with the Good Samaritan, when he takes him to the inn and says, whatever this costs, I'll cover it.
I'll cover the bill.
Yeah.
It's atonement. Exactly. And so, but through that atonement, who is the goat taking us into? Who is this guy in the wilderness called Azazel? And so I didn't want to address earlier when you said the scapegoat. I think, humbly, that translation is a very pleasant reading of the text that hides us from the polytheistic nature of the Hebrew mind. Because if we say one goat is for Yahweh and the other one just is the scapegoat that takes the sin into the wilderness, then what we've done is not dealt with the idea that there might be another God out in the wilderness who the sin is going to. And so, humbly, I think that translation there are a lot of things about every translation that I think are not good because it could be better, but I think that this is one of the only cases where I think they actually did a bad job by changing Azazel to scapegoat.
So in your definition, it makes Azazel sound as though it's a verb, an action, because they say it's to remove. So could it be that it was sent into the wilderness to remove, as opposed to being a noun that it's going to being an action? Because it says in your definition, in ritual of Day of Atonement, equals entire removal of sin.
So this is Brown Driver Briggs. They say entire removal of sin from sacred places into desert on back of goat, symbolic of entire forgiveness. So it sounds like Brown Driver and Briggs would probably agree with you.
Yeah.
Can I, real quick, this was my plan. I didn't have a video for this week, and I actually had something a little bit different. And I hope that it has not gone away here. Because I want to play a little audio clip, if that's okay. So the Bible Project, these guys, Tim and John, who we watch their videos all the time, they're currently in a podcast series on, wouldn't you know it, the Torah. And they've spent this whole year from January, and they're going to be finishing Deuteronomy at the end of next month, going through the Torah. And so if you want to continue your studies from this class, I cannot recommend them enough. I listen to them at the gym, on the road, everywhere I go. They're just always talking about the Torah. So I want to play a little clip from their episode on the Day of Atonement and how they address this topic. So I don't have a way to make this loud besides just holding it right up here. That doesn't go through the speakers. So I'm just going to do this, and we'll see if you can hear it.
Goes out into the wilderness to a cut-off land, the opposite end of the cosmos in the biblical imagination. And what's interesting is Azazel is not brought up there.
Noticing that.
Here it's just called the realm of being cut off in the wilderness, which is the opposite of guard. So scholars call this the elimination ritual. And I learned a lot about this from reading lots of scholars. One particularly illuminating account for this ritual was a scholar named Roy Gain, in his book Cult and Character. It's a whole book about purification offerings in the Day of Atonement and the problem of evil in the Hebrew Bible. So I'm just going to talk through this kind of extended quote, but this was hugely illuminating for me. And he says, no part of this goat, the living goat, is offered to Yahweh. This is not a sacrifice. It's an elimination ritual. The biblical prescription does not call for the death of this goat. It is simply sent away as a ritual garbage truck, carrying controlled toxic waste to Azazel. Now, Azazel's precise nature is elusive. The common understanding of Azazel as a scapegoat, referring to the goat itself, is ruled out by the fact that the animal is sent to Azazel.
Right.
You could even sniff that out in reading the NIV.
Right.
Yeah. So obviously the goat could not be sent to the scapegoat. The reason for the lot ritual before Yahweh is that he must decide the role of the goats through what appears to be chance. Through the lot ceremonies, the goats are designated as belonging to Yahweh and to Azazel, respectively, each being a party capable of ownership. The fact that Yahweh is a supernatural being could be taken to imply that Azazel is the same. But the animal is not an offering to Azazel. Rather, the live goat transports Israelite failures to Azazel, who ends up having to take this noxious load. The ritual is an unfriendly gesture to Azazel.
You know what it makes me think of?
Yeah, good.
Do you know that prank where you take poop and put it in a paper bag
Light
and
it
then
on
light
fire.
it on fire and then leave it on someone's doorstep? And
Who's ever done that?
Oh, wow. You're never.
So,
Well, if you just change the word Azazel to Satan in all of those expressions, it makes all the sense in the world.
It makes
Two
perfect
goats,
sense.
one lot for the Lord, the other lot for Satan,
Mhm.
and so on, all the way down the line.
Now, we don't know if Azazel is exactly equivalent to Satan if they're like exactly the same spiritual being. Because there are a whole bunch of spiritual beings who are for Yahweh, and there are a whole bunch of spiritual beings who are against Yahweh. This could be another one who is against Yahweh, or it could be exactly the Satan who Jesus met in Matthew chapter 4 in the wilderness. And he's confronting the same spiritual being that Israel had been sending their sin to every year. I love that mental image, though. Yeah, that's exactly. I think that's exactly what's going on here. Is you have Yahweh who dwells with Israel, and then you have this other God, strong God, whatever that means, who dwells in the wilderness, and the sin of Israel can't stay in the camp, but Yahweh has an enemy, and he seems like the perfect target for sending this sin to on this dump truck of a goat. And I think that, I think that really, like, I hate to say anything bad again about translators because they've done an amazing work, and all of them are way smarter than I'll ever be in original language. But in my understanding of today, and I say this humbly because it can change, it seems that they've done a poor job with Leviticus 16 because it kind of hides that spiritual warfare that's going on there.
Well, and it seems like they defined a word using the word. It's like, here's this goat, and it's going to be a scapegoat. What's a goat? Or what's a scapegoat? Well, it's the goat that you send in the wilderness.
Yeah, it's the goat that escapes.
And it's just like, what? Nobody knows what that means.
Why did they send him to the wilderness?
Yeah, totally.
For a specific purpose.
Totally. And so, one goat goes in to the tabernacle, and one goat goes out from the tabernacle. So I know you noticed that because he really emphasizes that strongly in the book. And I just want to point out one more little quote from here. Okay, before I read this. Matthew chapter 24, wheat and tares, I think. Or is that the goats and the sheep? There's two parables in the kingdom of heaven parables. One's in the kingdom of heaven parables and one's in the eschatological parables that come along with the Olivet Discourse, both in Matthew. One's in 13, one's in 24. Sorry, I get it mixed up. One of them is a field where the owner of the field plants wheat and then his enemy comes along and plants weeds. And as they're growing up, the workers of the field, the people who work for the owner of the field, go to the owner and say, someone has planted weeds in your field. Do you want us to pull up the weeds? And he says, nope, don't pull the weeds up, lest you pull up any wheat with the weeds. Wait till everything's ready to harvest, and then harvest the wheat, and then harvest the weeds. Both things are harvested at the same time, right? Parable of the sheep and goats. There are going to be people at the end who say, Lord, Lord, when did I see you thirsty and not give you something to drink? Or when did I see you hungry and not give you something to eat? Or unclothed and not give you something to wear? And Jesus will say, away from me, I never knew you. And at the other end, when did I give you water? And when did I give you food? And he says, whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. Well, those ones are called sheep, and the other ones are called goats. And the parable goes that he's going to separate the sheep on his right, by the way, and the goats on his left. And the goats, well, the sheep are going to go into his presence, but the goats are going to go out of his presence. And all of this is sort of this eschatological dualism, which, by the way, just parallels the same dualism which we saw in Eden, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because biblical themes don't stop being biblical themes because you make it to the New Testament. It's all the same dualism that we see, and it takes place, if you fast forward that all the way to Revelation chapter 20, you're talking about the white throne judgment, where the Lamb's book of life is opened, and then the other books are opened. And if anyone's name is not in the Lamb's book of life, they go to the lake of fire. And then the next chapter, at the end of chapter 21, tells us if anyone's name is in the book of life, they dwell in the new creation, the new heaven, new earth, and new Jerusalem. And so you have this dualism of the saved and the not saved, of the sheep and the goats, of the wheat and the tares. And so what Morales says, it is not difficult to see how this separation of the two goats could be readily perceived as portraying a final separation, a day of judgment in the ultimate sense. And so he, by saying much less than I just said, is arguing for the possibility, not the certainty, but the possibility that we can take these two goats of the Day of Atonement, one as going into the tabernacle and one as going out of the tabernacle, as being a symbol of, because the sacrifices always represented the people who were being sacrificed for, being the symbol of the people going into the presence of God or out of the presence of God at the eschatological judgment. I think that made sense. That might be the clearest thing I've explained tonight. All right. Okay. I think you probably noticed in the book and in your own reading of Leviticus that he doesn't start putting blood on things as he's going into the tabernacle. He goes all the way in, and he has the smoke with him to shroud the presence of God in the most holy place, because otherwise he'll die. So he has the smoke that he's making. He goes all the way in to the most holy place and starts sprinkling the blood from the west end to the east end. So it's like he's pushing, rather than purifying on his way out to in, he's going all the way in and then purifying on his way out. So it's like he's pushing the uncleanness out of the tabernacle as he goes. And remember, all of this is in solution to the Nadab and Abihu incident. Even the Azazel thing, right? This is all in solution to chapter 10.
John, did Aaron, did his consecration as a priest get negated with the abomination? Is that why Yahweh's just speaking to Moses here?
No, I don't think so. I think that Yahweh is just speaking to Moses because this specific law pertains to Aaron. So it still had to be, almost in a sense, had to be mediated. So before, with chapter 11 through 15, he was speaking to Moses and Aaron, who were mediating to the people. But now he's speaking to Moses, who's going to tell Aaron how to do the Day of Atonement. So it's almost as if, even though Aaron is a high priest, there still needs to be that step in between Aaron and God, as long as Moses is there. And I think that lends further weight to the final sentences of Deuteronomy, which say that a prophet like Moses hasn't come around. Like, Israel is basically left, even with a high priest, they're basically left without mediation. And so you end the Torah, spoiler alert, with that anticipation of Jesus to be the mediation between God and man.
That makes sense.
Okay. I'm trying to see what else I needed to teach out of here. The Azazel thing was the big one, and we kind of did that. Consecrating from uncleanness. 17 is a funny verse. No one may be in the tent of meeting from the time he enters to make atonement. That's not the right chapter. Oh, chapter 17. Okay, so that was all I had on chapter 16. Chapter 17 is sort of continuing the Day of Atonement a little bit, and then it's going to kind of break up towards the end, and that's where we're going to finish for the night. But is there anything else on the Day of Atonement? In Hebrew, the Day of Atonement is called Yom Kippur. And remember, Kippur, Kaparet was the name of the mercy seat in Hebrew, right? Kippur means to atone for or to cover. So this is the day of covering. This is the day when the sins of Israel are covered. Yeah.
I'm sorry if I missed this, but so who wrote the end of Deuteronomy? That Moses died. So
I asked you that question once before.
Maybe we'll talk about that when we get to the end of Deuteronomy. Someone else. I'll just say that.
He wrote his own obituary.
I doubt it. I mean, he was a prophet, so maybe.
Yeah. He knew it was going to happen.
Never anybody liked me.
He does somewhere else call himself he says, I think it's in Numbers, where it says that Moses was the most humble man who ever lived. And we're like, okay, Moses. So, okay, yeah. Good question, but we'll answer that when we get there. Yeah. So 17.
I want more, Linda.
Yeah, I got to keep you coming back, right? Okay. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron and his sons and to all the people of Israel, and say to them, this is the thing that Yahweh has commanded: if anyone of the house of Israel kills an ox or a lamb or a goat in the camp, or kills it outside the camp, and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to offer it as a gift to Yahweh in front of the tabernacle of Yahweh, blood guilt shall be imputed to that man. He has shed blood, and that man shall, remember, not be an Israelite anymore, be cut off from his people. This is to the end that the people of Israel may bring their sacrifices that they sacrifice in the open field, that they may bring them to Yahweh, to the priests at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and sacrifice them as sacrifices of peace offerings to Yahweh. Okay, so why would someone kill an animal? To eat it. So why is it important that it's a peace offering and not a burnt offering?
Because you need some left.
Because you get to eat the peace offering.
Right.
If you have to bring it as a burnt offering, no one ever gets to eat meat. So it has to be brought as a peace offering. And then why not just let them kill it?
So the priest can eat.
Well, check this out. So that they shall no more sacrifice to goat demons after whom they whore.
Yeah, that's what I had here,
That's
is to
pretty
keep
cool.
people from sacrificing animals in secret.
Yeah.
Away from the priest.
And so if...
But doesn't this mean you can't just butcher an animal?
Right.
Every animal
Right.
is a sacrifice.
That's right. And later on, as Israel grows and they live in Israel proper, in the nation, and they're all spread out, the expectation is no longer that they wouldn't take all of their animals to the temple, because then, like, how is Zebulun up in the north going to ever eat meat? They're not going to go to the temple all the time. They need to sacrifice animals, and if they did, by the time the meat got back to where they would feed their families, it would be bad. And so what is going to happen later on is they're going to come up with a law, I think it's in Deuteronomy, that talks about if someone needs to sacrifice an animal at their home, what they can do is kill that animal and send money, the value of that animal, to the tabernacle, and then that money would be essentially given to the priest to buy another animal. And so real quick, before you sidetrack me, they shall no more sacrifice to goat demons. So, in the camp, or kills it outside the camp. In the last chapter, who did we just learn is outside the camp?
Azazel.
Azazel. So if you're going outside the camp to sacrifice a goat, what's the concern? You're going to Azazel to worship Azazel, to sacrifice this goat or cow or whatever it is. Does that mean Azazel is a goat demon?
A lot of
Cool.
metal albums make a lot more sense now.
Right.
What?
A lot of metal albums make a lot of sense now.
Yeah, with the whole like goat head and the, yeah, totally.
So
Okay.
I was just going to say that in a practical sense, taking all the animals to the priest makes sure that they're butchered correctly,
Mhm.
which would keep people healthy. And if you're doing it in secret someplace, you would do it wrong and, make yourself sick and die.
Yeah, make yourself sick and die, or maybe accidentally eat some of the blood or some of the fat that was never supposed to be eaten by anyone, but burned on the altar. Yeah.
Yeah.
That also presents another problem, and that is those that aren't perfect, right? You
The animals that aren't perfect?
Yeah, you can't offer a sacrifice of an imperfect animal. They have to be without blemish. But
Even
God,
for the peace offering?
doesn't it?
Let's go to Leviticus 3.
Because that would mean that you could never kill an imperfect or a blemished animal, and yet,
Oh yeah, without blemish. Yeah.
Yeah.
and yet that would be the majority,
Majority
of
of
their
them
food, I
would,
would
yeah.
think.
Great question.
Mm.
I don't know.
They would just be used for breeding, I guess.
Maybe used for
Do you
breeding.
use a blemished animal for breeding?
Hmm.
I would think that
Jacob did.
I would think that their idea would be that if it's a blemished breeder, it's going to breed blemished stock.
Yeah. I mean, that's why Jacob was breeding the animals with the imperfections, is so that he could take them from Laban.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a great question. I'd never thought about that. I can throw out a maybe, that maybe the peace offering for someone to eat and food is different than the peace offering for actually making a peace offering, but that's just a maybe. I'm not sure.
We'll have to just stop right here till we figure it
I
out.
guess so. We can't keep going. So, you can't move on until you understand everything.
That's right.
Oh, no.
So glad that's not true. We'd still be in Genesis 1.
Yes.
All right. So, verse 11. This is, the Day of Atonement is awesome. It is the center point of the Torah. It's what we've been building up to. It's the center of the center of the center, right? And I don't know if you noticed the picture that he put in this book. that showed how Leviticus 16 itself, it's on page 177, how even Leviticus 16 has a chiastic structure to it, with atonement in verses 16 through 20a at the center of that chiasm, which means that not only is Leviticus 16 the center of Leviticus, which is the center of the Torah, but now you have Leviticus 16 itself as a chiasm, so you have a center of the center of the center of the Torah. Is covering, atonement. So, seeing and understanding Jesus as the thing that brings purification for uncleanness or impurity is the most important thing that the Torah can do for us, because it's the center of the center of the center. So if we're going to talk even more in detail about this in Numbers 19. By the way, I think I forgot to say this. This is now the second sacrifice outside of Leviticus 1 through 7. The third one's going to come in Numbers 19. The thing that relates Leviticus 14 and Leviticus 16 is the two animals. One being killed, and whose blood is used for purification from uncleanness, and one going into the wilderness. The bird was unspecific. It just said, it goes into the open field. And I don't really know what to do with that. But if that's related here to Leviticus 16, then where's that blood going? Azazel. Pretty interesting, maybe? I don't know. I don't really know what to do with that. And when we get to Numbers 19, we're going to be able to relate that sacrifice, even though it's only one animal. It's mixed with the living water and the cedar wood and scarlet yarn and hyssop, just like Leviticus 14 and the offering for cleansing from leprosy had those same elements in there. So all three of these sacrifices are all sort of like intertwined with each other, and they're the three that sit outside of Leviticus 1 through 7.
So that also presents an interesting potential parallel of where Jesus went after the crucifixion. Maybe he stopped on the doorstep of Azazel to
after the crucifixion?
To let him know what happened.
Before he came back on Saturday. Where was he Saturday?
Oh, where was he Saturday?
Maybe he went to let him know he had lost this battle.
But the doorstep of Azazel's in the wilderness, not in the grave.
Well, in a sense.
Okay.
But if you're talking Satan, maybe he paid him a visit.
Well, maybe.
Let him know things were done.
Yeah. Cool.
Just a thought that popped in.
So, boy, my voice is just shot right now.
You're almost done.
We're almost done. I have one more point to make. And I think that this might be the most important point of the Torah. Okay, so verse 11 of Leviticus 17. For the life of the flesh is in the blood. You remember that from Genesis 9. And I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement by the life. So who gives the sacrifices? God. Because we are, at least I think, maybe you don't think, but I have always thought, and even knowing this, will resort to the idea that Israel is making sacrifices to Yahweh. But the reality is that Yahweh is giving the sacrifices to Israel for Israel to make for atonement for their souls. I mean, yeah.
Isn't that a picture of Jesus giving us crowns in heaven?
That's exactly what I was just going to say. It's if that's not a picture of Jesus, then like, come on, what are we doing here, right?
I did say, I give my life to you. No one takes it from me. I give it freely.
Absolutely, absolutely. Like I default to thinking that Israel gave sacrifices to Yahweh. You know, I give tithes to the church. Like, it's so backwards from, like, if you actually understand who Yahweh is and his character and his nature, to think that I give him anything is the stupidest thing ever.
He gives us something that we give away. So it all belongs to him anyway.
Exactly.
He gives us our very life.
He's giving them. These sacrifices are not from Israel to Yahweh. They're from Yahweh to Israel. And they're for atonement. They're for covering for their souls. And so that, in and of itself, I think shows how desperately God wants humanity back in the garden. So, that's my last point for tonight.
Thank you, yes.
Yep. Anything else? I mean, we're a couple minutes early, but I don't think anyone's mad about that.
No. I had actually underlined 11 and wrote Jesus on the side of it.
There you go. So you would beat me to it.
Yeah. Now you just confirmed it.
There you go. Awesome. Hey, Jason, would you pray for us tonight? Thanks, man.
Dear Lord, thank you for the opportunity to come here and just learn more about you. To learn about how you atoned Israel and eventually us too. We just thank you for this time together. Pray for safety on the way home. Lord, we just love you and praise you. We pray this all in your name.
Amen.
Amen.